All right, Phil Steele is our guest. The Phil Steele College Football Preview, a must-have football fans every year. And Phil joins us now here on the Williams Tractor Hotline. Well, there's a lot of stuff that's happened, Phil, over the last 48 hours, but I think people in Arkansas still kind of bewildered about Friday when the SEC announced the 2 extra games on the schedule. And it's, of course, for Arkansas, if it weren't for bad luck, they'd have no luck at all. They get Florida and Georgia added on for this 10-game schedule, Phil.
Yeah, and it doesn't pair, does it? You would think that they would probably pair off the lower teams in each division against each other and the upper teams against that, but didn't quite work out that way. I think of the teams playing in the West, Texas A&M drew Florida and Tennessee, which is tough, but Arkansas drawing Florida and Georgia is even tougher, and clearly that probably makes it the toughest schedule out there because not only does Arkansas have to play all 6 teams from the SEC West, but they play the top 3 teams out of the East in Georgia, Florida, and Tennessee.
That is, it was the reaction instantly was well, the SEC set out to sort of job Arkansas, but I think if you look at it, Vanderbilt got kind of the same deal. They're going to get Alabama and LSU. I think this has more of a protect the top 6, protect the top 4 feel to it.
Yeah, I agree. That's what it seems like. It seems like, try to make sure that the SEC gets the teams with the best records in potential playoff. And as you mentioned, Vanderbilt drew a couple of tough games, and Arkansas drawing Georgia and Florida extremely tough. So it's the new games, if the intent was to balance the schedule, didn't do that. I think the intent was, let's go ahead and get some teams with outstanding records at the top.
Phil Steele's our guest here on Ruscin Zach. And so you've got, this situation. Let's kind of take a step back and I want your assessment of the Arkansas program. Of course, the Chad Morris thing doesn't work out for 2 years. They bring in Pittman, a first-time head coach, but he's been here before as an assistant, and he has had to deal with simply an unprecedented start. No spring practices. A global pandemic, and now maybe the toughest schedule of all time. It's just one thing stacked against him after another here.
Yeah, I agree. And talking to the coaches like I did this year, talked to 110 of the 130 head coaches out there. I think the thing that I came away most with the biggest impact this year would be that experienced coaches with experienced teams. No big deal missing out on spring practice. Those coaches all said, well, we had our winter conditioning. We were ready for the spring. It looks like, what might happen is a redshirt freshman might not be able to pass up a junior based on the 15 spring practices, but you put the ball in the field, we'll be ready to play. Talking to the first-year head coaches was a little bit different this year because the coaches generally didn't have great knowledge of the players, hadn't seen them on the field. And naturally, there's some knowledge, but I think all first-year head coaches, as a rule of thumb, are going to struggle this year with the lack of spring practices. And then, as you mentioned, with Arkansas, we're talking about the 3rd head coach in 4 years. So generally, there's going to be some players leaving and players coming in. We're talking about going from a smaller offensive line to a bigger offensive line, which is not a one-year process, although they have put on some good weight in the offseason. And same thing defensively, looking for more size up front. So I think it's an extremely tough situation for Sam Pittman stepping into, and then getting tossed Georgia and Florida on the schedule sort of exacerbates that a little bit.
Something like the reconfiguration of the schedule has to drive you crazy. Putting this magazine together. When you look at what Arkansas now faces, assuming that they finish a full 10-game slate, what's realistically possible for this program in 2020?
Granted, it's playing. And I think playing SEC only schedules this year hurt Arkansas and Vanderbilt to begin with, because you're looking at potential wins like Nevada, Charleston Southern, ULM. They're all gone now, and having to play just SEC teams, there's going to be very few games where Arkansas is favored. Having to play Mississippi State and Ole Miss would probably be the 2 best shots they have this year. Those teams are also going through first-year head coaches, as is Missouri. So, depending which coach gets it straight right out of the box first, I think the best case scenario for Arkansas might be 3 wins. I mean, that would probably end up being a pretty good year, because I'm cutting Coach Pittman some slack right now based on the tough situation he's landed in.
Phil Steele's our guest here on Ruscin and Zach. You can go to philsteele.com and find out more about getting your copy of the college football preview. So they bring in Felipe Franks, and I believe this really upgrades the quarterback room right away. I mean, you, of course, studied him at Florida, and now as he comes over to Arkansas, what do you see with Felipe Franks in the addition here?
Yeah, and last year, would they start 6 different quarterbacks during the course of the year? So, it's an instant upgrade. And Franks has got size. He's a big guy. He's 6'6", 235. I thought he showed improvement last year at the start of the year. He's hitting like 75% of his passes. He's got some mobility, and then, of course, he was injured and out for the year. Now, Florida Gator fans, knocked him a lot, but I like what I see out of Franks. And, having a veteran quarterback and one quarterback, I think, is a big plus there. So I think he will come in and do well, provided the offensive line gets reworked quickly and is able to provide him protection.
I want to ask you about the West in general. The AP put out their top 25, which is probably useless now, but it feels like LSU got a bit of a kiss in the rankings, because they're going to lose virtually their entire starting 22, but yet they're ranked 4th in the country. Alabama's Alabama. Where do you think like LSU, Auburn, and A&M fit into that mix? Are they ready to challenge a team like Alabama, or is it Alabama and everybody else?
Well, I have Alabama winning the West. The thing I like about them is the fact that, Dylan Moses, an All-American linebacker, was injured out for the year prior to last season, as was another projected starter in Joshua McMillan. They had to go with a couple of true freshmen in Shane Lee and Christian Harris. Those guys are now both back as sophomores. They had 3 freshmen starting on the D-line in Christian Barmore, DJ Dale, and Byron Young. Those guys are all back as well. So they're going to have a good defense. They got a number 1 rated offensive line, number 2 set of running backs, number 3 receivers. The only question mark is quarterback, but they've got a really good supporting cast for either Mac Jones or Bryce Young. But I think the main contender for Alabama, I went a little bit out of the box. I went with Texas. You look at Fisher's brought in 3 great recruiting classes in back-to-back years. And talking to Coach Fisher last year, what stood out to me was that they had very few seniors on the entire team, 4 or 5. And they were playing a brutal schedule, much like Arkansas this year. They actually had to play 3 number 1 ranked teams last year. Number 1 ranked Clemson, number 1 ranked Alabama, number 1 ranked LSU, number 4 Georgia, and also number 8 Auburn. And they lost those games. But I told Coach Fisher last year, I'm going to put you on the cover of my national magazine next year. Well, next year's here. 17 returning starters, Kellen Mond back at QB, my number 13 rated O-line, number 12 rated D-line, both the linebackers and DBs rank in my top 10. I think A&M's going to have that big jump this year. As far as LSU goes, I do think talent-wise they're going to reload, much like Alabama's reloaded in the past, but let's keep in mind, Alabama was always reloading to 13-1 teams that either won 1 or lost 1 or 0 games. LSU, the prior 7 years, had not lost less than 3 games in a season. So when they reload, I think it's going to be more to that 3-loss level rather than Alabama's type of reload. Remember, they lost 4 draft picks, and 6 other guys signed free agent contracts. Good talent, but probably a year away. And with all that experience, you'd like to, or inexperience, I should say, you'd like to have spring practice. They did not this year, and they're all the way down to number 129 on my experience chart. And with Auburn, the biggest questions I have for them is at the line of scrimmage, which is an area that there was no questions with last year. I thought they had one of the best offensive lines in the country, perhaps the best defensive line in the country last year. The defensive line will be good with Big Cat Bryant and Truesdale up front, but the offensive line loses practically everybody from last year, so now it's a little bit of a question. They'll probably pull an upset or 2, but I've got them middle of the pack. And then at the bottom of the West, I had to go with the 3 first-year head coaches. I believe all 3 will struggle this year with the lack of spring practices coming in, having to learn the players, and that's where I put Mississippi State, and Arkansas.
And I would imagine those 2 of those there, the Mississippi schools, we've been talking for weeks now, that's the most likelihood for an Arkansas victory is to knock off one of these first-year coaches like Mississippi State, Ole Miss, or Missouri in the rivalry game with Eli Drinkwitz taking over.
Absolutely. And, a real good shot I would say, besides Missouri, I think Missouri is probably talent-wise the weakest of those three teams, so very winnable, would be Mississippi State. And the advantage taking on Mississippi State this year is Mike Leach is coming in. Not only is he a first-year head coach, he is drastically changing the offense. I mean, let's face it, their quarterbacks have been known more for running. They have big old offensive line that have run blockers. Now they got to come in and learn how to pass. Mike Leach always leads the nation in highest percentage of passes thrown in a game. And while he's got some talent to work with, like A.J. Costello, let's keep in mind his first year at Washington State, they were 3-9. And he had a spring practice that year to incorporate his new offense. Here, no spring practice, complete shift of the offense. Remember Arkansas's struggles going from Brett Bielema's big offensive line to more of a smaller, speedier offensive line with Chad Morris, and they struggled the last 2 years.
Last year when we had you on, you and I both agreed that Tennessee was one of those teams we thought was going to make the jump, and then they lose to Georgia State and got off to such a slow start. How big is the gap between like Florida, Georgia, and then Tennessee and the rest of the East?
Well, it was huge. And, I'll go back to my conversations with Coach Pearl. When he first took over, coming from Alabama and Georgia, he was not enamored with the talent he had inherited there. He was like almost shocked at the talent level they had. And in that first year he had at Tennessee, they not only lost 7 games, they lost 6 of them by 25 points or more, so they weren't even competitive. You go back to last year, and as you touched on, they lost to Georgia State, lost to Florida by 31, lost to Georgia by 29. The Bama game was probably closer than the 22-point final margin, but still another blowout loss. And then they won their last 6 games. Now this year, Coach Bird likes the talent he's got on hand. He's had 3 recruiting classes. They have 17 returning starters, only lose 16 lettermen. And I asked him flat out, I said, Coach, you're playing, and at the time they were playing Oklahoma. I said, Oklahoma, Florida, Georgia, and Alabama all this year. Can you be competitive against these guys? And he said, Phil, I don't feel there's a team on the schedule that we can't beat. So he feels so much better about the talent they have. This should be the year for Tennessee to take that jump, and I do believe they have closed the gap on Florida and Georgia, and we'll give each of them a game this year.
Phil Steele's our guest here on Ruscin and Zach. I want to pivot back to Arkansas for a moment because there's a former head coach in the league running the defense at Arkansas now. Of course, Barry Odom comes over from Missouri. He beat Arkansas in his last game, got let go, and then becomes the defensive coordinator at Arkansas. And I don't hear a lot of conversation about this, but I'm curious what they're going to do there defensively because, 35, 40 points a game on offense doesn't really matter if they can't get a handful of stops to get a win.
Yeah, 5.5 yards per carry. And if you're giving up that's a first down every 2 plays running the football against you. And that means that you have to bring that extra guy in the box. So what happens? 67% completion. So that was not a defense that, was great last year. And the defense, is a question mark naturally again this year. Now there's some talent, and I think Odom's new schemes may help. But I still would consider the defense a big-time question mark, especially with the fact that they did not have any spring practices to get it in. I like Bumper Poole at linebacker. Probably Greg Brooks at the nickelback safety spot. There are some question marks, though, when it comes to Arkansas, and they definitely have to get better stopping the run.
Phil, I've had to talk to some NFL personnel guys, and on the other side of the ball, they all point to Treylon Burks as an NFL guy if he keeps progressing. What's your sort of opinion of Treylon Burks and what he can do? Last year, they didn't even target him in the red zone. The kid didn't catch a touchdown. He's 6'4", 230 pounds.
Yeah, 6'4", 230 pounds, and I do believe that he has NFL potential. Now, the good news is he's going to be a true sophomore this year, so that means that he's got a lot of room for growth, and I think he's dangerous. I mean, they used him on punt returns, kick returns last year, even threw a pass in that game. So he's a guy that should be targeted in the red zone, but I think he's outstanding in the open field as well. I look for a big year out of him.
We're talking with Phil Steele here on Ruscin and Zach. Another thing that we've noticed here is that with Pittman, it just feels like even though he's never been a head coach before, anytime he's spoken to the media or spoken to Zach and I, it just feels like it's a better cultural fit than Chad Morris, who's this kind of fast talking Texan that comes in here and it was never really just a perfect kind of in the pocket fit. But with Pittman, it just feels like this is a straight shooting football coach, and this kind of what everyone's kind of needing right now here.
Yeah, I agree, and it comes back to the fact he's got experience here with Arkansas, and I'm on the Joe Moore Award Committee, so we talk offensive lines. Well, that's all we talk about is offensive lines on the Joe Moore Award Committee, and they love Sam Pittman. I mean, look at the job he did at Georgia year in and year out. Didn't matter if he had an experienced offensive line or experienced offensive line. A lot of respect on the committee for Sam Pittman as an OL coach and as a coach overall. So I think he's going to, tough first year. Cut the guy some slack. If he only wins a couple of games this year, that's okay. I think he'll get this ship righted in a short period of time.
Well, Spurrier used to say the only way you can do this, or the only way you can win, is to recruit your way out of it. You're kind of feeling he when we talk to him, he's just a very easy guy to talk to, and he seems to be relating to the players very well. And in the world of virtual recruiting, I mean, he seems to be hitting it off with most of his recruits.
Yeah, he does, and I think he will be able to recruit. And once you get Arkansas rolling, then once again, the wins equal better recruits equal more wins, and then it turns into a upward situation.
Well, we just need to see if they can figure out a way to play. That's the only. Then that's out of all of our controls, though. So, Phil Steele, our guest, the Phil Steele football preview, available at philsteele.com. Phil, as always, thank you so much for the time this summer. We appreciate it.
Yeah, real quick, just a note for your listeners out there is that the magazine's only available at Barnes & Noble and Books A Million this year. So if you're out driving around trying to find it, all the places you found it in the past, it's only Barnes & Noble, only Books A Million, or philsteele.com. But as always, a lot of fun talking football with you guys today.
All right, thank you so much. All right, that's Phil Steele, and all our guests join us on the Williams Tractor Hotline on Ruscin and Zach.